Alright guys, in this PowerPoint presentation we are going to be focusing on listening. And first we'll talk a little bit about the late nature of listening before we get any deeper. Basically listening is an active process of making meaning out of another person's spoken message, and there's some key things that I want to point out with listening. Listening is an active process. It's not automatic. And one of the biggest ways to define what listening is to define what it's not, and it's not hearing. Hearing is just the actual biological process of sound waves hitting the eardrum and there being noise in your head. That's different from listening. Listening is an active process where you make meaning of another person's spoken message. This is where you're actively decoding the messages in which you are receiving and in turn responding to them. So the key part of listening is it's an active process. It's not automatic. It's where you are actively ascribing meaning to the messages that are being sent your way. And it requires a lot more attention and requires a lot more effort than simply just hearing things. It's effective. Listening effectively is important. So what we're going to talk about is being an effective listener and the different ways and the different types of listening that are required to be an effective listener. We spend like 50% of our day listening to things, whether it's on TV, with our friends, with our family, with our instructors, whatever it is. We spend a lot of our time throughout our day to day just listening. So it's important that we recognize that. And good listening skills are essential in the workplace, with our families and our social relationships and our intimate relationships. Basically, we spend a lot of time listening, and listening is crucial for any type of relationship, any type of interpersonal relationship we're going to have, whether that's workplace, families, intimate partners, whatever. Listening is important. We do it a lot, and it's essential to any type of relationship that we're ever going to have in our life. According to 1,000 human resource professionals, this was done in a study, the ability to listen. This is what people are looking for in jobs, basically. Number one, the ability to listen effectively and counsel others. The ability to work well with others one on one. If you're in a one on one setting, you're going to have the ability to listen to another person. Work well in small groups. Small group communication, one of the most important aspects of working in groups or teams, is listening to the other group members and understanding the other group members. Also, gathering accurate information from others when people are talking and sharing information. One skill that's huge that employers are looking for is your ability to gather that information accurately. And page 219 of your textbook goes a little bit further on this information. So pay attention to that and know what employers are looking for and be familiar with the information on that page. There are some misconceptions about listening. One myth is hearing is the same as listening. We've already talked about that. Just hearing is a passive, easy, lazy process. It doesn't require any work to actually hear anything. It takes a lot of work to listen effectively. So this chapter is going to talk about those two differences and how to be an effective listener and not just a passive hearer. Listening is natural and effortless. This is also a myth. Hearing is natural and effortless, but listening takes a lot of effort and a lot of work, and it's a skill that can continually be developed. And all listeners hear the same message. This is not true. We've talked about how communication is this social construction. Not everybody hears the same message the same way. So it's important that we recognize this in order to be effective listeners. Your textbook lays out the Hurrier model of effective communication. It's an old classic model, but one that still holds pretty true today. And it basically shows how to take the right steps to be an effective listener. The first step is hearing. So this is where you're just perceiving sound. Again, the biological process of sound waves hitting the eardrum. The next step is understanding. This is where we comprehend what we just heard. Remembering, this is where we store it when we need. This is where we store it so that we can retrieve it when we need it. We hear something, we comprehend what it is, we kind of package it up, and then we put it away kind of in our storage unit that is like our brain, that is our mind. What we do then is we interpret it. We understand the verbal and nonverbals to assign the meaning and signal to the sender that you get it. So you've heard it, you have understood it, you're remembering it, now you got it compartmentalized in your brain, and now you are looking at the verbal and nonverbal messages to it, and you're assigning meaning to it and letting the person that's sharing this information know that you get it. And then you evaluate it. Is it accurate? Is what you heard just accurate? You separate facts from opinions, you consider prior information, so on and so forth. But the next step is evaluating it, and then you respond. You give feedback to whatever it was that you just heard. So read this in depth, be familiar with it. The Hurrier model, it's an old classic model of listening, but one that's still pretty solid, and it's good. It's very descriptive in your textbook. There's 3 different types of listening that we're going to focus on, and then we're towards the end going to talk about how you can be better at these 3 types of listening. There's informational listening. This is where you're listening to info. The goal of this is to learn something. This is where you're just trying to learn new information. There's critical listening. This is where you listen to analyze and you listen to kind of make a decision about something. And then there's empathetic listening. This is listening to support and understand somebody else. So these are the main different types, whether you're gaining information, you're analyzing something, or you are just trying to be supportive and understanding of another person. These are kind of the main categories of listening. There are barriers to all these different forms of listening, however. We talked about noise earlier on in the semester, the psychological, physiological, and physical noises that are actually in our way. These are all the different distractions that take place. So if you have something on your mind, if there's a loud noise in the background of the room, if you're being distracted by anxiety or something like that, these are all the distractions that get in our way. We also do pseudo-listening and selective attention. This is when we're pretending that we are listening, but we're actually not, or we're only paying attention to certain parts of the conversation. And we also provide false feedback behaviors during this. This is when you're watching TV and your mom's asking you to talk, or you're getting scolded while watching TV and you just kind of shake your head and you're like, yeah, no, I hear you, but you're not actually listening. This is pseudo-listening. Information overload plays a huge role. We've talked a little bit about this. This is when you have too much information being shared with you to process. This is when there's too much coming your way. Your brain can't keep up. You can't make decisions because you're receiving way too much information. And this varies. Some of us can handle more information than others, but either way, at some point, all of us reach a point of information overload where we have to pump the brakes and say, hold on, you're saying a little bit too much. Let me make sure I understand what you're saying. Glazing over. This is basically daydreaming. This is when you're just not paying attention at all to what the other person is saying, and you're not really trying to actively listen and understand what they're saying. We have a rebuttal tendency. This is when somebody's saying something to us, and instead of waiting to hear out their entire argument or their entire message, we already start to form rebuttals. We already start to form counter arguments before the rest of the message or the rest of the information or the rest of whatever it is they're trying to share with us is shared with us. Closed-mindedness gets in the way. And this is where we don't even want to listen to ideas or positions that we disagree with. So if we're strongly conservative, we're right-winged, and we're hardcore Republican, we might not even listen to what people on the left have to say, what a liberal might have to say, what a Democrat might have to say. We're not even willing to hear them out. This is where we don't even listen. We're not even willing to engage in listening to positions that we disagree with. And then also competitive interrupting. This is those people that just constantly want to control the conversation, so you can't even get the rest of your thoughts out. You can't even complete your thought before they're already jumping in and starting to interrupt what you're saying in order to kind of dominate the conversation. So these are different barriers to effective listening. So finally, how can you become a better listener? With informational listening, it's always important to separate what is and isn't said. It's always important to focus on, okay, this is what the person said, but they're not saying these things. We often slip into implications. We kind of say, oh, well, they're implying this, but if they haven't actually said that, maybe we shouldn't jump to that conclusion. Avoid confirmation bias, meaning avoid and try your best to pay attention to everything, not just the things that we want to hear, not just the way that we want to hear them. Try to take the message objectively instead of saying, oh, they said this and I agree with it, so I'm going to listen to that, but I'm going to not pay attention to these things that I don't agree with. And listen more for substance than style. What is the content? What is the quality? What is the information? How credible is the information, as opposed to how effectively if some how how effectively is somebody sharing this with me? How sexy or how fun or how energetic are they when they're sharing it? Focus more on the content, focus on the facts, focus on the details a lot more. And this kind of goes hand in hand with this kind of segues into critical listening. With critical listening, be skeptical. Don't just take everything that people tell you for what it is. Be skeptical, criti- criticize things, think analytically, try to analyze information. Don't just take it in and accept it like a vacuum. Evaluate the speaker's credibility. Who is it that's telling me this information? Who is it that's saying this stuff? And are they credible to even be saying it in the first place? What experiences or expertise do they have in this area in which they're talking about? Who is the person that's sharing this message with me? And then think about probability. How likely is it that what I'm hearing is true? How likely is it that this is actually legitimate and not just something that's being made up or fabricated to a certain extent? With empathetic listening, focus on listening without judgment. Try to listen objectively and not judge other people for their situation. Acknowledge feelings. Acknowledge that I understand how you feel. That must not feel the best. I get how that feels. I feel that way sometimes. Talk about feelings. Don't act like feelings don't exist. Acknowledge them, talk about them, and show that you're there. And then communicate support non-verbally as well. We talked about nonverbal communication and how that communicates our emotions. This comes into play with empathetic listening. Use your nonverbal communication effectively to show support. So this was a short chapter, not a whole lot that I could expand on in there, but be sure to read the book. Be sure that you're familiar with the different ways of listening, how to improve them, the Hurrier model, and definitely beware of the difference between listening and hearing.